Polishing the Bones, Chapter 3. The analysis begins. Laura and Nick's decision to move to California was centered on Nick's goal to be a writer. He hoped that his parents' social and political connections would be helpful. After being blacklisted in the McCarthy era, along with many people in politics, her in-laws still found work difficult to come by. Laura says, "I was game, curious about California's progressive politics and the writing community." She, Nick, Karen, now a toddler, and Nick's parents moved from New York City to California, initially renting a house altogether near Palo Alto, not far from Stanford University. Laura found freelance design work and continued to support the family. Her husband and his friends were trying to break into the field of science writing. Very little money was coming in from his freelance work. Laura became pregnant again. "I wanted to have more children and was happy to be pregnant. This time I refused medication to prevent miscarriage. The pregnancy and birth went well, and my baby was healthy. He was such a beautiful baby boy, Mark. Our home was crowded and our schedules chaotic. Finally, Nick's parents moved out. I felt such relief." Laura took her two very young children to Ohio to meet their grandfather and stepmother. She says, "They hadn't made the trip to see us yet. I am very glad I took my babies." Not long after the visit, Laura received a telephone call from Jacqueline, her father's second wife, who had been his secretary for years. Her father had died suddenly, unexpectedly suffering a massive heart attack. For Laura in her early 20s, this was another shocking, traumatic loss of a parent. Jackie invited me to visit her in Ohio. There was to be no formal service or funeral for my father. I liked Jackie when she was my father's secretary, and I still do. At some point later, I realized that it was likely that they were having an affair for many years during my parents' marriage. At first I was really distressed with this realization, but it helped me to understand my mother's rages, her deep sadness and loneliness. All these moods and behaviors were probably related to this. It wasn't just my father's extensive work away from home. This memory led Laura to another memory of loss. When I was 7, my brother George, who was 12 years older than me and my only sibling, was away finishing college in Chicago. This was when Nani, my beloved maternal grandmother, died. She had lived with us when I was very young. She was my hero and the first real artist I knew. She encouraged me in my artwork. She was wonderfully lively. I was told she was a very independent thinker. Nani divorced her husband during the Great Depression after he forbade her to become an artist. She left him, traveled alone to the Southwest, and became a painter. I never knew my maternal grandfather. Nani later returned to help my mother when I was a baby. She cared for me when I was 3 years old, when my mother was hospitalized for some time. Later, I learned that my mother's hospitalization was for a nervous condition. There was no funeral or memorial service for Laura's grandmother. Not long after her father's death, Laura discovered that her husband, who had been staying home to care for the children while Laura worked at a design studio, was having an affair with her close friend. The affair was going on while I was working. I felt shocked and betrayed by both of them, she says. her hands come up, covering her mouth. I was enraged. Making mental notes to myself, I reflect that by age 3, Laura had suffered a maternal separation of weeks or possibly months due to her mother's depression. By age 6, she had lost the security of her nuclear family, with her father's work often far from home, and her only sibling was considerably older and living away. Laura had gone with her mother to live at a boarding school. At age 7, her beloved grandmother died. In her adolescence, she lost her first love. She left college after just 1 year and was married at age 19. Not long after this, her mother died suddenly, and Laura's first pregnancy ended in a miscarriage. Her in-laws' support was ambivalent, complicated, and problematic. She realized that her father had an affair with his secretary, who became her stepmother. She experienced the second sudden death of a parent, her father. She was abruptly orphaned while raising 2 small children and supporting an unfaithful husband. Her parents and grandmother were the only family members who were the most important people in Laura's early life. They were the ones she depended on for safety and love. During these losses and her husband's betrayal, there was no time, place, or emotional space for her grief. There were no gatherings of the extended family or friends for her emotional support. As I listened, I perceived that Laura's in-laws and the circle of friends that she and Nick had developed were quite egocentric, narcissistic people. She really had no functional community to engage in or to support her. I also wrote a note to myself about the importance of the fact that Laura did not have an emotional breakdown. This was highly significant. Unlike her mother, who had required hospitalization for a nervous breakdown, Laura did not break down. I perceived strength in Laura's psychic constitution. I wondered how she coped, in what ways she sustained her balance with such chronic traumatic losses. I know from many years of experience that there is always a steep emotional and physical price for chronic trauma and loss. Even before I knew about Nick's affair, Laura continues, I was becoming increasingly fatigued and eventually went to a doctor. I was working and had young children, but the fatigue was too deep for my age. The doctor ran tests. I was diagnosed with breast cancer. Here I was in my mid-20s with 2 young children and almost no support, receiving such horrible news. I was immediately scheduled for surgery, a radical mastectomy, to be followed by radiation treatment. At that time, in the early 1960s, cobalt radiation was used. That treatment required that I be kept in isolation. My mother-in-law took over the care of the children. I was in the hospital for weeks and missed my children terribly. I knew it was dreadful for them, for us, to be separated for so long. Even when visiting was permitted, Nick refused to bring them to see me. While I was in the hospital recovering from surgery, he let me know that he and his mother had given away the family dog. I fully realized this marriage wasn't working. Laura returned home from the hospital, devastated physically and emotionally. Her deep fatigue continued in the following weeks. Returning to her physician, further tests were run. She was then diagnosed with hepatitis B and C. It was determined that the hospital had accidentally infected her with a contaminated blood transfusion during the surgery. In those years, there was not adequate blood screening. Weeks of slow recovery followed. Her brother George came to help her. Laura went on living with what she didn't know was a liver-damaging, life-threatening condition. During this time of acute illness and recovery, Laura says she finalized the emotional fallout and made the decision to divorce her husband. She would use what small amount of money remained from a very modest life insurance policy left by her father. She left Nick and took the children to live in a small rented bungalow not far from the ocean. She describes this time alone with her young children as perhaps one of the happiest times in my life. She took Karen and Mark to the beach daily, made new friends with other young mothers, and was fortunately able to continue to work as a freelance designer. She took a few short-term jobs as a project assistant on documentary films. A skilled researcher, she also had an eye for set design. She had worked in fabric and textile design and now wanted to try costume design. It was her dream work, a passion of mine since childhood, she says. She took jobs as a project assistant on documentary films to help meet expenses as a single mother. Various company executives attempted to extricate sexual favors from her in exchange for freelance work. I refused. There was one man, Gregory, who Laura described as special, kind to her, and wonderful with the children. They dated, and he helped to restore some of her confidence in her body and femininity. After the loss of her breast and the extensive scarring from the mastectomy, Laura says quietly, "I felt such shame about the loss of my breast." This was before reconstructive surgery was suggested or common. Gregory wanted to marry me, and although I did care for him and was grateful, I declined. Her textile and design work was successful, and she was contemplating a job offer in Hawaii. At that time, she received a call from a man who needed an assistant for a science documentary. He had heard about Laura's work on other projects. She went for an interview. At this point in the session, she decides to stop discussing past history and shifts to her more contemporary life circumstances. I feel that perhaps this was all she could share with me of her painful early history. It is the first extended session. Laura shifts on the couch and takes a deep breath before she continues. That was over 30 years ago. Eugene was the scientist who called her for the interview. Laura says, "He and I really hit it off immediately. Soon we were swept away with each other. He was an amazingly confident man, and he admired my talents. He was honest about his difficulties, both financial and marital. I knew Gene was facing large debts and complicated divorce. He had 2 young children in his first marriage, and Laura had her own divorce problems." She smiles. "We went ahead anyway and married in a whirl of happy chaos. We were young and fearless. We had very little money or property, but we had enthusiasm, drive, and love." Laura describes Eugene as a gifted scientist with an open heart and mind and deep appreciation of the arts. He was becoming recognized in his field. Laura reminisces, "He hired me as an assistant on the documentary project he was making for NASA. We worked so well together. We were a dynamic team. It was California in the 60s, and anything seemed possible." Laura appears wistful as she considers how to describe the next years. "So much happened in those years. Those times were both good and bad for our family. There were so many people in and out of our lives, some famous, and some real characters. We attended many art shows, science lectures, exhibitions, and learned about space programs. Our lives and work revolved around meetings. Always there were meetings. Creative meetings, budget meetings, crisis meetings. Endless projects required endless meetings. It never stopped. Laura slows down and her mood changes. During this exciting and hectic time, there was a frightening tragedy when my children were teens. In our neighborhood, 2 blocks away, there was a brutal murder of a family we'd known. Drug addicts, high on methamphetamines, broke into the neighbor's house. They probably were looking to steal money for more drugs, but found the family there. Those innocent people were viciously murdered. Laura is silent. After a minute, she goes on. Karen and Mark had more unsupervised time in those years than I'd wished. They were resourceful kids, but I knew that not everything that happened to them, around them, was for the best. Eugene and I worked ceaselessly in our creative work. We did so much together, and she is telling me that she feels guilty, without using that word, for not being with and not protecting her children. She accepted Eugene's limitations as a stepfather. Work came first for him. Family and parenting were second. She couldn't rely on her former husband, Nick, to help raise the children. His inconsistent contact with them created additional problems. The now adolescent children were angry and confused. This anger was displaced onto her and Eugene. Karen and Mark began acting out, skipping school and hanging out with some unsavory characters. Laura is describing her very lonely journey as a remarried mother, without grandparents to help, without extended family support, and without strong, consistent fathering for her children, and all the issues and additional stress of a blended family. The time for our first session is almost over. Laura shifts to the edge of the couch while looking at the clock. We had scheduled 2 hours for this initial session. I am aware that we have traveled far from the initial subject of her lost love, Alex, who was the trigger for her call requesting treatment. Laura's attention turns back into the present time, describing how Eugene has met with success from his many years of hard work. He currently has many business demands and creative science projects underway, many of which take him away from home. He travels frequently and is often away for weeks on end. I go with him sometimes. Recently, she joined him on a business trip to Japan. She smiles while describing Japanese country inns and exploring many art and craft studios. Having this time to explore was unusual for us during business travel. This trip to Japan was especially meaningful to me. I enjoyed the arts, culture, and people. She then says, "Now I am finding that travel appeals less to me. Jean is preoccupied and emotionally unavailable on the trips. I want to be at home, in my garden, or reading, and having a quieter life." Laura, as with all my patients, dips in and out of memories and incidents and feelings. A life story is rarely related in a straightforward way. It never unfolds neatly. History taking for me is an ongoing project, like archaeology, with layers and bits unearthed slowly over time. I am listening and observing intently how Laura speaks. Her choice of words, her body language, what she says and what she leaves out, what evokes great feeling in her, and what she skirts over breezily. I listen for the places where there is an abrupt change of subject. Is this because there is too much discomfort or pain with the subject? Eventually, I will ask her more about this, as it is happening in the moment. I know that anyone who begins psychotherapy or analysis in midlife comes with quite a life story. Numerous complicated relationships, many unfinished plans, and so much life to review. Like many people, Laura traveled, experienced living in several communities, and made moves across the country. There are various chapters in all of our lives. These chapters are usually described or centered in relationships with our most important loves. We all experience personal losses of people, with the places lived, and with our accomplishments or our failures. Sometimes we know we are standing at a crossroad, at a major decision-making time in the path or trajectory of life. As I listen to Laura, I feel she is at such a crossroad, and I believe she may know this too. As this first session is coming to an end, I note that Laura has become increasingly tired and less animated. Her posture is less upright. She is now sighing deeply, leaning forward and holding her face in her hands, with her head bowed. I say, both your parents died suddenly, separately, many years ago. You lost your grandmother, your heroine. You never got to say goodbye. Those deaths were not observed with care. You gave birth to 2 babies and lost a pregnancy, all within a difficult first marriage. You suffered catastrophic health crises. Your very small extended family was barely engaged then, and that continues now. Your children are grown and far away. Your husband is invested in an endless stream of creative projects, requiring much of his time and attention away. As I continue reflecting with Laura on the themes of loss she is describing, she begins to weep deeply, her body shuddering. This extended initial interview is unveiling the series of chronic, complex, traumatic losses. We sit until she comes to the end of her tears. Laura's initial presenting problem of a broken heart and depression was an expression of her many losses. The timely trigger of Alex's phone call, unexpectedly, serves as a path leading to her associated memories of her aching and broken heart through these multiple losses. She had already been thinking about beginning treatment. Her accompanying symptoms of depression with frequent bouts of sadness and crying, literal pain in her heart, difficulty sleeping, and loneliness are symptoms communicating her unresolved, not fully experienced grief. I hear her search for intimacy, her emotional and physical fatigue, and other things left unsaid at this time. Her animated persona of lovely delight and simplicity that covers her deep despair from most of the people in her life is beginning to crumble here as I mirror back her rather well-hidden truths. This is where we connect emotionally. I am witnessing and describing the life she is bearing. As painful as this can be, there can be a sense of relief in being seen by another and not hurt or humiliated in the process. We both have the courage required to begin this journey. We have stepped into the relationship, the vessel of her analysis.